transcription software like a million times easier. All right, so how you doing, dude? I guess I've never seen your face or heard your voice before.
Yeah, I'm doing well. What about you?
I'm doing all right. A bit of a long day. My poor wife she's in the final stages of her thesis, and it's a lot of work. So I'm doing the best I can to support her. A lot of running around, I'm sure you can imagine. Um, I won't take too much of your time, but I really, I'm happy to have the chance to talk to you. And I'll get into some questions in a moment, but I want to start up by kind of saying again, like, I can only congratulate you. Like, that is a really pretty profound debut. Um, and I think part of the reason that I wanted to do an interview is, I think it's the sort of book that as a reader, and as a writer myself, but as a reader, I'm sort of forced to be like, okay, how on earth did somebody pull this off? Do you
Wow.
understand what I'm saying? Like, I can't simply walk away from it and be like, okay, well, that's a book. So I guess like I'll segue that into my first kind of question. In terms of like the inspiration for this, like where did this idea come from? This, the room of cloth, the book that gets passed around, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for giving it a chance. I'm a self-published author. I just recently released the book in February, so I'm still promoting. I'm very new to this game. At least self-publishing. I've been writing for a long time, but thank you so much for giving it a shot and being enthusiastic about it. Um, Similar to what you were expressing right now, like when I was writing this book, I would even ask myself, like, where is this coming from? Because it kept getting deeper and deeper. That original premise just kept expanding in ways that I hadn't anticipated at all. So I was, if you were surprised, I was surprised too in the process of writing it, and it really kind of shocked me because it just went and it touched on, like, we had exchanged messages before, and it touched on themes and ideas that were so almost primeval and
Very much so.
yeah, that were so primeval and fundamental to human experience. And I kept surprising myself. But I'll start with, I guess, the original inspiration for it is kind of silly. I don't know if you're familiar with what are called creepypastas.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
I kind of put that together, but I was yeah.
yeah. So a creepypasta, for those who don't know, right, is the basically like a viral story that gets passed around, especially on the internet. And so I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of them. And Slenderman, for example, is like one of the most
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
famous creepypasta figures. And, he was crowdsourced. So basically, people contributed to this mythology and made it seem like he was almost real. They would put out the various photos where he's edited in there. And now
Yeah.
that's like a common trend that we see. And I always thought that aspect of the creepypasta was fascinating. That this line between fiction and fantasy gets blurred, and it's impossible to tell what's real or what's not real. Where does the story begin? Where does the truth end? And as an aside, that's happened to basically all of our information landscape. Who do we trust now? Where do we get our verifiable information from? From the media or from independent journalists? Everyone has an agenda now, it seems, and there's no way to really figure out where the truth is. And I think that the creepypasta and characters like Slenderman capture that. So that was one of the inspirations. Was okay, I like this idea of creepypastas, like this sort of weird liminal, not true but not false space on the internet. That was kind of scary to me. That evoked a sort of dread that I thought would be interesting to explore in a book. And my secondary goal also with that was to take, not necessarily Slenderman. That character to me always seemed kind of stupid. To be fair to him, right? He's this like gangly.
Tell that to my sleepless nights.
Yeah, he can be scary. There are contexts in which he's scary. I don't know if you've seen Marble Hornets
You know
on
exactly.
YouTube.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there are some contexts where he's scary, but there was always this like weird tongue-in-cheek quality to the character and to creepypastas in general. You have like really good ones, and then something the writer can't can't stifle himself or herself, and there's this weird just jokey quality that starts to emerge and it undermines the horror.
Yeah.
So on a more superficial level, I like the idea of a creepypasta. I thought that would be interesting to explore in a longer form work like a novel. But I also thought it would be interesting to play it straight and to say, okay, how far can we take the dread or the terror that something like this could evoke?
Yeah.
So in the book, there's the manacled man character. He's kind of my attempt at saying, all right, I want a scarier Slender Man, somebody who you can't really make a joke out of. This is something that is beyond being spoofed. It's like spoof proof, and it embodies something that's actually really dangerous and really hateful of what it means to be human. And he kind of developed in that vein. So the original premise of Rue McCloth was really saying, I like the idea of creepypastas. I like how there is this strange tension between truth and fiction online, especially. And I wanted to bring that to life in a novel and see how far I could take that premise.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up creepypastas. Actually, I mean, when I was reading this thing, one of the things about the horror, there's two things about the horror to me that really jumped out. I want to get back to inspiration in a moment, but like I'm glad you brought this up because one of the things about creepypastas and internet, Slenderman in particular, a huge part of the fear, at least for me, and I imagine for some people, is the fact that like what makes he becomes dangerous to you when you become aware of him, like
Mm-hmm.
the act of thinking about the creepypasta, like now that you've read this, you're here, you can't, there's no going back, right? That's kind of
Yeah.
what, now that you've seen this, it's like The Ring, but like, taken to the, now that you've seen the video, you're in it now. um
Mm-hmm.
and I think that that's one of the aspects of this sort of book that I found really interesting. I mean, like one of the ways at which it really like surprised me was I started reading it, and the first thing I thought was like, oh, this is realistic fiction. This is a story about like addiction, and
Mm-hmm.
and it is, but like it's it's going to be a very like grounded story, and then it starts to like there's this shift that happens where kind of there's a blurring between truth and facts, a la Toni Morrison. And suddenly other characters begin to become exposed to like almost a mind virus. And
Mm-hmm.
that's where it starts, at least for me, to become really deeply compelling. But the other thing about the horror, and I would love to hear your take on this, and I think I mentioned this to you, is that like part of what makes this book scary, and obviously I'm not going to say what makes it scary for you, whatever, but what makes it scary for me, and I'm going to guess again, a lot of people, I don't want to project too much, but I think what makes it scary is that it it exposes a certain kind of rot in the world, because all of the characters, and I don't say this judgmentally, but every single one of
Mm-hmm.
these characters is rotten in one way or another. There is rot
Sure.
inside of these people, and it's and not in some way that's easy to push away and condemn and be like, oh, I'm nothing like him, or I'm nothing, it's actually, I mean, Otto, it's easy to push away a little bit, but like all
Mm-hmm.
these characters, they're so fleshed out, but they're also, there's a darkness in them, and there's a darkness in their world. And what makes the story so scary at the end of the day is that, the monster goes away, I get to close the book and the monster's gone, but the darkness is still there. And I kind of would love to hear like what for you as an author transformed this from, creepy pasta, here's a monster we can't spoof, into there's like there's bile in our world. Like, how did you get
Yeah.
there? It's an amazing transformation.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that compliment. I will say first, I want to comment on what you mentioned about the kind of viral quality of the creepypasta, because I don't even think that wasn't even something that I had thought about creepypastas in general, right? But that's just something that manifested in the book, which and I see why, because creepypastas are viral, so they spread from person to person, and it's like a game of telephone. So the substance gets distorted and morphed, and it evolves over time, and we see that in the novel, right? So that manuscript, and again, you later realize that it's not a manuscript. The manuscript is one form of this mental virus, as you mentioned. It just keeps evolving and changing. Um, now what you asked is loaded, because it started as this exploration of the creepypasta, and then it transformed through various tiers. But I would say the first tier was an exploration or commentary on the internet. Uh, I personally have always been kind of anti-technology. I'm sort of like a Luddite in some respects. I used an iPhone 3 for 8 years before getting the iPhone 8, and now I'm only begrudgingly accepting, okay, I have to upgrade this thing. Um, but I also like download all my music. I don't use Spotify or streaming services. I'm
Oh
just,
man.
yeah, I'm. It's not. It's partly out of principle, partly out of just distrusting. I think the impermanence of a lot of the cloud and technology in general that we sort of rely on. And so when I was thinking about the creepypasta, an element of that is it's online. It's a uniquely online phenomenon. So that led me to consider the internet. What is scary about the internet, and what gives right? Why do these creepypastas and stories exist? Why do memes exist? And there's something about the internet that is almost like a garbage dump of human society, where the things that privately we all kind of feel, those intrusive thoughts or those deeply gothic senses of maybe guilt or
Intrusive
resentment
thoughts is a
or
very good word for it. Yeah.
anger, yeah, those things that we can't publicly air, right? Normally, right, in a I'll say healthy society, we find ways to sublimate and we find ways to process those feelings.
Yeah.
But now that we have the internet, we don't need to do any kind of sublimation. Those dark thoughts get dumped into the internet. It's almost like an unconscious of society. And so, especially, yeah, especially if you know we live in a much more alienated age than I think we ever have. So as interconnected as the internet makes us, it also has this tendency to pull us away from the person to person, blood and bone connections that we have in our daily lives. So if you're someone who's socially awkward, or someone who is maybe depressed or anxious, or you don't have the tools to navigate your social life, right? You're not as extroverted as you need to be, or you're not as competent as maybe you wish you were, as society tells you to. You go online. That's your refuge. It's your safe space. And for example, there's something called VR chat. I don't know if you're familiar with that, where
I think I've seen a lot of videos where like people will talk about like really difficult experiences in VR chat that they could never like in real life, do. I think I've seen things like
mhm. Yeah, so VR chat, you use an avatar, let's say of a character, for instance, and then that's you, and you get to interact with other people. And so at first blush, it seems like a good thing, because someone, like you say, who would not be able to
that.
discuss something in person is able to have a more therapeutic experience online, or to get that social interaction. But what if that person stays in online, right? Never translates that that social experience to real life, right? Never elevates to that next level. So then the internet becomes like a crutch, and so you become addicted to this safe space, this comfort that it provides. That turns into echo chambers. That turns into more extreme political polarization. That turns into more antisocial tendencies, right? So maybe you started in a place where you were relatively on the edge, but you could have been rehabilitated. But now you spend all your time online. You're deeper and deeper submerging yourself in this dark space that isn't quite real life. It's very real, but it is not what you were really evolved for. It's not what is going to necessarily bring you true happiness, right? It's giving you a facade
Like your
of
brain isn't set up to.
correct,
Yeah.
correct. And so you're being tricked. Your biology is being hijacked by uh, whatever promise or whatever illusory happiness the internet provides you in the moment. It's like another form of addiction: pornography, gambling, drugs.
Yeah.
And that's where the addiction theme comes from in Rumakoff. So the internet is like a form of heroin, it's a form of cocaine. And so all of these different things are salves that are created to, on the surface, help um, the alienated and the downtrodden of our society, which it almost by design puts them into that state, but then doesn't give them the tools necessary to really nourish themselves in a genuinely healthy, psychologically stable way.
Yeah.
So very loaded. Sorry. So to keep it succinct, all of that is basically, I think, what the book ultimately transformed into. So it started as that commentary on the creepypasta, on the viral quality of the internet, and the fear that's there. And then that's where that extra layer of social commentary came on, because by necessity, I had to interrogate, well, what is the internet? Is it good or bad for us? And then what are the ways that it can be exploited? Because that tends to be what we see.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I want to say. I want to move on back to inspiration. Actually, I want to talk about, character too. But really quickly, like one of the things I admire about the work, and I think is interesting, you just sort of went there, is that I think the book is very much about politics and
Mm.
it's apolitical. And that is a really interesting thing you've managed to do. It's you. I think you write and you speak as well very much about like our political climate, but you don't. You avoid kind of, the highly, information silo echo. You've avoided the echo chamber while pointing to the echo chamber, which I think is very difficult to do, actually. And I don't know if that's something you've set out to do, but I remember, reading the book and being like, it's kind of amazing that this is about politics. I can see the politics, but
Yeah.
it's, there's no platform here. This is just like, you're pointing at something that's very real. But to sort of take that actually and shift it a little bit, so we talked about the origin of the concept, that sort of the central conceit, plot of the book, however you want to put it. Is that where it, so you started with the concept, or did you start with character? Because the characters in this book are so fleshed out, and I wonder, like, what was the process by which your people entered this world?
Okay. I'll make a quick note about the politics,
Yeah,
just
please.
because you, I think that's interesting. I personally, I feel that I'm a very traditional writer, I suppose. So I think the story and characters come first, and any kind of theme or agenda or politics that you want to inject in there, I think that has to be an accessory to the story. So I think why it might seem like there's politics, but it's not. It doesn't define the plot or the characters, is because it's more of a supplement to it. It's more of a byproduct than it is like my actual intention. Because like I was saying earlier, I didn't necessarily dive into the story with the intention of scrutinizing any particular facet of society. It just sort of developed on its own. And then, of course, throughout the revision process, I see that happening. And so I can, amplify parts of it here, or downplay parts that I think go too far. Uh, so that's as far, I think that's why it kind of has that feel that you're describing. Um, as far as characters are concerned, so this particular book started with the creepypasta
Okay,
premise,
okay.
uh, but I, as a writer, always start with character. Generally speaking, I'm not a good world builder. I don't think I'm a good world builder, but I do think my strength lies in characterization. So it's tough to go back to the inception point, because we're talking like 2015 at this point. But the creepypasta premise started, and I remember the very first draft of this didn't involve Sebastian as we know him. It was some other character, but he was also male, and he was young, probably in his 20s. And he found this thing online that he was really interested in. He wanted to spread it to his friends. Like, it was almost like a revelation to him. And I remember that was the original draft. So then I think the character of Sebastian, or Rose, he spun out from that first archetype. And where does he come from? So I don't base characters off of anyone particular in my life, but I have seen people who have dealt with different degrees of substance abuse, and I've seen how people struggle with alcoholism, drug use, and things like that. I've seen how people deal with depression. I feel like this is more and more. We all have an experience like that, where if it's not us, it's someone else in our circle. So I think that character kind of grafted a lot of those different things that I've seen in my life, especially through the plights of other people. And it just became very clear that who would become interested in what the Rumacloth is, this viral idea, this infectious thing that masks itself as some kind of boon, right? It would be somebody who was already addicted to things. He was already pursuing things like drugs, and sex, to try and make himself feel better, to try and find that connection that he desperately wanted. So I think that's where that character came from. So I would say that Sebastian is kind of the linchpin of the book, because everything else manifested around him, right? Because once I had him, then you have to obviously have the history. So, okay, what made this character who he is? It's kind of trite to say that there's a Saw backstory, but he does have, there has to be a history there. Well, what explains him? Because if he had a well-adjusted life, he wouldn't be this way, right? He wouldn't be in this hole. So then you explore the parents and you explore the abuse that he was receiving. That gives rise to the sister. So then Sarah spins out from him. Then Caesar, of course, is the extension of his world. So in the interest of world building, the drug underground that he was affiliated with, I had to have other characters populate. So Caesar populates, and then Bless and Otto populate, and that's sort of how everything spins out. It starts with the one character who is a response to the central premise, and then the other characters just take on lives of their own because by necessity they have to have different wants and goals. I will say Sebastian is not my favorite character. I ended up gravitating much more to Sarah. I feel like she's probably
So
the
to
one I have.
tell reading it,
Yeah,
yeah.
I probably have the most kinship with that character. She's also an English teacher, so I'm a teacher by trade. So that's a little bit more of me getting fed into that. But yeah, so they all kind of spin out from the central locus. That's where I think the characters come from.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, speaking about, Bless and Otto too. I mean, Caesar's obviously extremely fleshed out and in a lot of interesting ways. I was interested though, the choice, because as a writer, you can have a bunch of characters and they can all, be expressed, but it's having, sort of sections from their perspective. I think for me, and spoil, I don't know why I'm talking about spoilers, but like, there's a section from Otto's perspective. And like for me, that's like one of the more incredible moments of the book. And I think it's one because it's an extremely bold choice. It's not something you had to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's a thing you chose to do, and I'm really glad you did. Um, but but I guess I'm fascinated by that choice, and I want to understand. Again, I'm glad you did it, but like, what led you there? Why did you make the choice? You know?
So yeah, so the reasoning is, it might surprise you, but um, originally there was no Otto section.
Yeah.
There was Otto the character, and then we never got into his headspace. There's a chapter where we get briefly into Bless's headspace, but we never get into Otto's. And I think at the time, originally the reasoning was that I didn't necessarily need to. Right? Otto was a representation of this organized crime element that was an extension. It was thematically also a metaphor for everything else. This social rot that you were
Yeah.
describing
Yeah.
earlier. So I guess I didn't feel that I had to really explore that character. When I was in the querying process a little over a year ago for this book, so prior to self-publishing, I was trying to get a literary agent. One of the suggestions I received in that process was that the book was too short. It was at 68,000 words and it needed to be longer. It needed to be 80,000 to 90,000 to meet publishing standards for horror. So,
Jeez.
so I went, yeah. So I had to sit down again and say, okay, where can I inject more content into this book without radically changing it? Because I had trimmed it so, like, I was very happy with what it looked like, and the form it had. I didn't necessarily want to add or really revolutionize any part of it. But what was I missing? I was missing an Otto, right? That was a character who we hadn't had an opportunity to really get insight into. And you get bits and pieces here through his dialogue, but never really get a sense of who he is. And so it just became very clear that one of the ways I could expand the story and get more content was to focus on these characters that maybe I hadn't focused on very much of. So Otto was a choice. So was Miranda. So there's more of her in this published version than there was originally. And yeah, that I think it seems kind of like an anticlimactic answer to your question. It wasn't out of some deep artistic design. It was because I practically needed to add more content to the book, and it worked out though in a poetic way because I was inspired, I guess, to that suggestion compelled me really to want to write, and so uh, reactivating, I guess, some of the ideas that I had had about those characters because those were portions that I was adding a couple of years after the fact, after I kind of put the book down. So that Otto section and some of the Miranda section might feel different slightly stylistically or might
It
feel a little bit
does. Yeah.
fresher.
That's,
Yeah,
that's I think
that's
what's powerful because of it though. There's something
right.
about it, like. I don't know. It's
Yeah.
like a
So
weird like anti-hypothesis. I don't know how else to like.
yeah, so it was just coincidental that happened. But I do think, like you're saying, it adds a whole another layer to the book, and it makes it, that much stronger.
All right, so I just have one or two more quick questions. You mentioned sort of the querying process. Now, obviously, you ended up self-publishing.
Mhm.
Spoiler alert, he ended up self-publishing, guys. Um, so the obviously you got one piece of feedback about changing the length, et cetera, et cetera. But like, I can easily imagine you making that revision and resubmitting. Why did you choose to self-publish this? Why go down that route?
Well, there are multiple factors to that, but I would say one of the one of the decisions was one of the reasons for the decision was recognizing that the traditional publishing process just takes so long.
Yeah,
Even if I were to be successful and eventually land an agent or impress an editor at a press and get the book published, I'm still looking at maybe multiple years just to get one project out. And it's all whimsical. You have no idea if an agent or editor is going to wake up on the right side of the bed, or eat breakfast that morning, or come at your project at the right time with the right perspective, because all it takes is just one subtle thing wrong in their day, or one subtle thing that's changed, maybe their client makeup or whatever the case is,
yeah,
that's going to affect whether they say yes or no. So really, part of it was the sense of wasted time, that I could self-publish and I could get the book out there, and maybe not have the same privileges as a traditionally published author, in the sense of having that marketing force, especially of a big press, like of the big four, for example.
yeah.
But I could still leverage it to my advantage. I could promote it the way I wanted to promote it, and I wouldn't have to make concessions creatively. So those were two of the big reasons: was not having to make concessions, and secondly, just being able to control that process and make sure that I could actually get it out into the market. Um, I would also say generally, I think horror is not a genre that is, not that it doesn't sell well or it can't sell well, but it tends to be much more limited compared to what's really in demand in the traditional publishing space right now. So, I'm not a writer of young adult or fantasy or magical realism or romance. Those are all highly in demand genres. I don't really touch those. So I figured, if I'm going to self publish, then I might as well do so, especially with this harder to market type of work. And I do think that Room of Cloth and the other books that I would like to write or, publish eventually, they don't really fit neatly into a genre category, which I think is uh, traditional publishing bristles at that, right? They don't like something that is too experimental. Maybe I'm wrong in that respect, because that same agent who suggested that I change the length was also very complimentary about this book. And
Yeah.
she said that, upmarket horror has a place, but I personally just don't see it, I guess, from where I'm standing. And it just seemed easier. It seemed more practical, and I think ultimately more, I guess, good for me, basically, to put it out there myself and to control what it looked like. And I wonder, if I had traditionally published this book, if you would have felt as strongly about it, because I'm sure, there are things that I'm sure I don't have to tell you, that you could look at the book and sort of say, okay, this probably wouldn't fly with the publisher and they'd want it edited
Oh,
or
absolutely.
mollified.
I could,
Yeah.
yeah. No,
And in
you're
particular,
absolutely right.
particularly with the character of Caesar, that was something that I was definitely nervous about during that submission process. And I wonder sometimes, if not the length, like if those elements were actually turning agents away.
Yeah, I definitely had a few moments where I'm like, yeah, you would have to self-publish this. Absolutely. I mean, I would sort of follow that up though. So my last question to you, because Zoom has a 40-minute limit, but also, I don't want to take up too much of your time. Um, I'm you mentioned, and I'm doing some mental math, you've been working on this book for 7 or 8 years. It's a significant amount of time that you spent, putting this together, and clearly. Oh yeah, see, there's my little Zoom window telling me running out of time. Upgrade. I think not. Um, 7 or 8 years. How did you know as a writer, and this is more of an interview question than a book review question, but how did you know as a writer that, like, okay, I'm ready. This book is ready. This is what it wants to be. Like, when was the moment? How did you pinpoint that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this book, I've written, if you include this, I've written probably about 7 to 8 novel length works. So this is, I think, the sixth one, sixth or the seventh. And I had about 10 years ago, I had actually first tried to query. That was my first foray into publishing. And I had taken a novel that I had written in high school at the time. I was still in college. I was very young. I was probably like 20, 21 when I was querying
Yeah.
this first book. And this is a book that I had revised again and again and again, but it was just fundamentally bad. You know, there is something was missing in the plot. You know, we all go through
Oh yeah, the
that
first book.
experience.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but we're stubborn about
Never
it
to
because
see the light of day.
yeah, we love it, right? We don't want to let it go. So then I wrote another book, and I took those two to someone I knew in college who was very well read. He was an extremely literate guy, and he tore them apart. And I still remember we had a Skype call, and he was just explaining to me all of the things that were wrong with these books, and then he would highlight the one or the occasional good things. And it really it was a tough pill to swallow getting that type of feedback, but it helped me crystallize what I was good at and what I had to do to improve a book. And that's where Room of Cloth started. It was this idea that, okay, I'm going to take that feedback that I got and I'm going to really try to write the publishable book this time. And I'm going to put all of my efforts towards that. So, you know, I don't, I'm not a full-time writer. I don't have that luxury just yet. I would hope one day to be able to do that. And so, you know, I would spend my summers and my vacation times focusing on working on the book. And so I would say the drafting process takes about a year, and then the revision and editing can take another year, maybe even 2 years, you know, depending on the speed with which you work. Uh, so I would say a few years, maybe 2, 3 years max, basically writing and revising and editing. And then I wasn't satisfied with just having one book. I wanted to write another book so that I could be more marketable to an editor or an agent.
Oh
Um,
yeah, because they want the second and the third. Yeah.
right. And this second book was not part of a series. It was unrelated, but I still wanted to have multiple books ready, right? So I could say, here, I don't just have this one, I have this other one. Fun fact, that book will be published in October. So that will be the next release. It's called Simulacrum.
And that's self-published too, right? That one.
Yeah, also published. And so that cycle repeated. So you have another 2 or 3 years, you know, tweaking that novel. And so it was about 2019, late 2019, right before COVID hit, that I said, okay, I'm ready to query because now I have two
Yeah.
completed books. So they take about 2 to 3 years to produce. It wasn't that Room of Cloth took 6, 8 years
Oh,
to
okay.
produce, right? It was kind of like on and off, tweaking, drafting this book, coming back and revising it. Um, but that's when I decided I was ready. And then COVID hit. That interfered with the querying process. I think it made it, you know, harder. Everyone was sort of discombobulated by that. Uh, I got a couple of full requests for that book. Never heard back. Then around 2022, 2021, I got I sent a request in. Sorry, I sent a query out, and that was the request that I got later that fall. Right, requesting, okay, I like it, but you need to add more length. And then I made the decision to revise and resubmit because this seemed like the best chance of, I think, of someone, you know, a gatekeeper
Yeah.
liking, you know, giving it a shot. So that led us to 2022. Took me about 6 months. Ultimately, I was rejected, and then that's what kind of inspired starting to explore self-publishing a little more seriously because I'd always flirted with it, but the allure, similar I guess to what the Room of Cloth provides, the allure of traditional publishing and having that marketing force behind you was what really kind of kept me in the game, kept me querying when maybe it might have been wiser to have self-published sooner.
I mean, I understand the wanting to, because it also gives you this feeling of like I made it. If you
Yeah.
get traditionally published, it feels legit, even though there's no real reason. It's just you've made it past the gatekeeper. All right, I'll let you go in just a moment. I want to say one funny thing about your book. At the end, you have the sample of simulac. Oh my god, I can't say it. Simulacrum. I never say that word. And what's funny is if I'm honest, like I don't think many people are going to read that sample, because what happened to me is I reached the end of your book and I was like, oh my god, like I had to like close my laptop and like walk away for a while. Like you can't, you're putting kind of another book after the end of something so intense, and it's like, what? Why did, like, that's not a post credit scene. That's a something else. I'm not. That's not a slap against the book at all. But like, you I don't know that many people are going to read it. I will check it. I'll check it out. Obviously, at this point, I've had enough distance from the book, but yeah, I just thought you might find that funny. It's the placement of it is perhaps unfortunate. But yeah. So, anyways, thank you for taking the time to talk to me. It'll probably be a little while for me to put this review together. I like to write kind of like, you know, I spend more time writing book reviews than I do writing books at this point.
Mhm.
I put a lot of, stuff into it. Um, but obviously I'll keep you in the loop on that. And again, just like, I'm gonna keep an eye on you, man. Like you've got something going here. Uh, and I look forward to your next book when it comes out. Please, like, keep me in the loop on that, because
Yeah.
I want to read it. I want to keep up with what you're doing.
Thank you so much. I will say, just funnily enough, with Simulacrum, I had a close friend of mine read that this past summer just to get some feedback, because
Yeah.
I was in the last final stages of revision, and that was also one where he said, like, he hasn't read Rima, but he read that one and he said he almost couldn't finish it, like it depressed him so bad, and he had moments where he just had to put it down. So I'm not saying that that's what I necessarily strove to be as a writer, but I am happy. I take that as a compliment. Um, I've always liked I've always liked horror, and I've always liked just going dark, just going into dark
Yeah.
places, because I think that that's where the most authentic and truthful uh, you know uh, ideas or visions of what it means to be human are. I think we
There's an
we too
honesty to it. Yeah.
yeah we too often marginalize that and we push it away, but we got to confront it. And I will say, as far as Ruma Cloth is concerned, this might not be the end of that story. So what I will say is keep an eye out.
Yeah, no, I think you mentioned a sequel. I will say, but before we sign off, I didn't actually find Room of Cloth depressing. I
Mm.
think there's a deep darkness to it, but I don't think it's necessarily like everything is bleak and doomed. I don't know. There's something about the honesty of looking at the problems in our world that, it makes them realer, but also like somehow smaller. Like, if you can name it, it loses its power. And I do think that like a book like that, well, yeah, there's some moments in it that, boy, oh boy, are extremely dark and painful. Absolutely, there are. I wouldn't say that it's ultimately depressing. So it's maybe Simulacrum is, though. I don't know. Maybe that's the one that'll break my heart. Yeah, we have a minute left. All right. So again, thank you so much for talking to me. Um, and I will message you with any other updates. If there's anything you want to say, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. So just thank you again for giving it a shot. And on a last note, I don't think that it's all doom and gloom either. I mean, whoever reads Ruma Cloth, pay attention to the last exchange between Sarah and Caesar. I think that that is kind of the antidote to the solution. It's the building block of a way to combat everything that this book critiques.
Exactly. All right. Thanks, man. I will
Yeah.
see you around. All right.
Thank you so much.
Yep.